we're continuing from the previous video in this one. So I'd be interested in seeing your dots. Feel free to send them to me or your bird dots, your bird made of dots. Feel free to send them to me if you like. I'd be happy to see them. It's always interesting how other people interpret and see the world. You didn't have to do that bird, obviously. It was just. And here are a couple examples of what other people have done. And you'll see the one on the right is all circles. But the one on the left, those dots are not. They're blobs of paint. And so, there's many, many ways that you can do this, many ways you can put this together. I don't know why that's bullet pointed. There we go. I don't know why stuff like that bothers me. I'm perfectionist, I guess. And so there's a whole bunch of things you could do, obviously, to create something. And in both cases, it was the variation of color and shape. And well, the one on the left is shape and color varied to create original design. Okay, and so that in essence is the dot. The thing to know about points is that they are focused points of attention, and they can be any shape. As long as they draw your eye to them, they're dots. Our red door, it's a point and a dot. Okay, lines. So, obviously the definition of a line is a mark connecting two or more points in a series. But what the reality is that it is a dot moving or a series of dots, depending on how you want to look at it. Depends on whether you want to look at it as in 3-dimension or 4-dimension, and time is the 4th dimension. So, line. All right. So, I in class, when we used to be, I can't get to that one. I'm just going to live with that, aren't I? So when I used to teach this live, I used to in a classroom. Actually, this is still in a classroom, but when I used to teach this in person, and I teach the exact same way in person as I do on these videos, so you're not missing anything by not seeing me talk. In fact, I actually think by focusing on these very clear, clean graphics instead of looking at me, it makes I become less of a distraction when I offer instruction. But that's a whole other conversation. So I would tell students, take out a piece of paper, and where you're taking notes, just draw a line. And I give them a couple seconds to do that. And then I would say, did it look like this? Raise your hand if it looked like this. And most of the class raised their hand. And as we talked about before, this is cultural. In our culture, this is a line. 99% of the time when people say line, this is what everybody thinks about. And so when you're coming up with designs, you want to throw away your first idea or your first thought, because it's going to be everybody else's. And it's hard to be original and creative if you're just doing what everybody else does. That is also a line, right? And those are lines. That is, every single one of those is somebody putting a pen down on paper and then drawing a caricature without lifting the pen. And so every single one of those is in and of itself a line. And what a line really is, as we talked about, is a series of points that are adjacent to each other. And while a point has no dimensions, I guess. Fix my grammar as I go. It's really funny how you don't see it when you're doing it. So where a point has no dimensions, a line has one. And it's X, Y, or Z, depending on how it's oriented. And the basic characteristic of a line is to connect or unite. And then the connection may be visible or invisible. We're going to talk about, I call them leading lines. We're going to talk about leading lines. There are invisible lines that lead your eye to other places on the composition. Where dots are about position, lines are about movement and direction. And so whether they're there or not, they're still lines. Okay? A line leads you somewhere. Your eye moves along it, seeking one or both of its endpoints. This movement and direction makes lines inherently dynamic, meaning they are not static, even though it is actually static itself. A line is not attracting you to a point in space. It's directing you toward and away from points in space. And so the opposite of connecting is separating. And lines can not only connect elements, they can also separate elements. And as we saw in the previous slide, those lines, some of them had colors inside of them, and those colors were separated by the lines. Lines can also cross barriers. Lines can be as long as you want them to. An entire drawing can be created with a single line without the pencil ever leaving the page until the end. A line is a pencil chasing a dot. I love that. That is one of my favorite definitions for what a line is. A line is a pencil chasing a dot. And Egon Schiele, an Australian artist, drew this with lines. These are all lines. And his pencil did leave the page, but not very often. As lines become thicker, they begin to be perceived as planes or surfaces, and they gain mass. Okay, so these lines are also rectangles. And to maintain their identity as lines, they have to increase in length as they increase in width. So the changing of the width of the line relative to its length has a much greater effect on the quality of a line, as changing the size of a dot has an effect on the quality of the dot. If a line continues to get thicker without also getting longer, at some point it ceases to be a line and becomes a surface or a plane. And as I said, these lines are also rectangles. And so where do they cross over? It's all gray area. Because not everybody's going to see these as rectangles. Most people are going to see these as lines. But if I were to create this in Illustrator, I would start here with a rectangle and cross over and draw the endpoint down here as a rectangle. Other people would draw it as a line and give it a thickness. So it's gray. It's hard to say. And so in that case, that's where, no right or wrong answer. You just have to be able to defend it. If I said those are rectangles and you said no, they're lines, and I said, well, this is how I would create them, and you say, well, it's my work and this is how I created them, then I'm like, okay, then you win because it's your work. A single line traveling in a curve around a fixed and visible point with an unchanging distance from that point eventually joins a starting point and becomes a circle. And basically what that's saying is if we start here with this is paint, and we go, say, clockwise in a curved manner, that line ends up becoming that circle. Okay, and so again, if the negative space gets filled in, it can be seen as a dot if it's a focus point of attention. So, this is very clearly a dot and a circle. And it may be a very thick line. So you can see how all this can get really confusing and really crazy. But the idea is that if you understand it and you can defend what you're doing and explain what you're doing from a place of understanding, most people aren't going to question it. You might get into an argument with somebody who's very, very pedantic, but most people aren't going to argue with you on these things. The endpoints of a line can be seen, or they can appear to move towards infinity, as we see in the image above. As lines are allowed to enter and leave a format without seeing their endpoints, their sense of movement is reinforced. These lines are, they appear to be moving. And so, in this case where we've got multiple lines and we've got these two, see, these lines are cut off. We know that these lines are all there is. But these lines look like they're going to continue to move. And this one, where it's cut off by the edge of the page, that creates a point of tension. So when you are designing elements and something goes behind something else, you cut it off, it creates a point of tension at that, and it does actually end up creating a focal point. And so the relationship between line and line is when two lines join, they create an angle between them. And the point of connection becomes the starting point to move in two different directions along two different lines. And multiple joints then begin to create a sense of altered direction. Okay, and so you start, this is where geometry comes into play. And if we change the color or value of the lines, we can then make them more complex. And Jackson Pollock's convergence is a prime example of this. They're paint blobs, but they're lines. He used a series of blobs, series of points that were blobs, dots, and he did them in lines. And then he varied their thicknesses and their color, and that's what ended up creating his artwork. And it's interesting, the longer I look at his work, the more abstract shapes I begin to see. And I tell anybody, it's like, if you want to appreciate him, get really, really close, because his paint is very, very thick. But also get further and further away, and your eye will begin to see these shapes, and it's pretty cool. And so, as we change the thickness or the weight, we create a sense of depth. We have talked about that. So that what ends up happening is that lines work together, and in rhythm, they can form things called patterns and textures. And we're actually going to talk about texture as an element. And so the previous image I showed you, this detail, that is what his work looks like up close. Just a bunch of lines. But because he varies the color of them, when you start to pull away from it, that's what it looks like from a distance. And in architecture, lines are very important. Not only do they represent elements like walls, sidewalks, roof lines, they also lead your eye. And this is a great example of how line is not just a line across the page, but can be quite complex in how it is laid out to create a very complex architectural plan. It's just absolutely beautiful. Okay, we're going to stop here, and I will see you in the next slide.